So it all is one thing. We are all one, that's true. And the one thing we are is consciousness. But at the same time, we are individuated subsets of that piece of consciousness. That's also true.
Hello, Tom.
Hello, Lulik.
Thank you for being here today. I'm really thrilled to have this incredible opportunity to engage in a discussion with you. You're a physicist and a consciousness researcher. You're the author of my big Tout, Tout for Theory of Everything, and it's a trilogy exploring the nature of reality, consciousness, and also we can say spirituality. And in your work, you describe the nature of our larger reality, and you provide a complete theory of reality, and you explain our purpose and connection to that larger reality, and also you derive a fundamental science that answers the problems and paradox of modern physics. So it's a big toe, a big work, a very big work. And my first question is to start with a context. What inspired you to explore the nature of reality, and how did you build your big theory of everything? From what I understood, it all started with your exploration of out-of-body experiences, but maybe it's not the whole story. So can you explain a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's not quite the whole story. It really started while I was in graduate school working on my PhD and saw an ad to learn how to meditate. It was transcendental meditation, and it promised that if I learned to meditate, that I would get by on less sleep. So as a graduate student doing lab work in physics, staying up all night was often necessary because there's big machines that have to run. In this case, it was a big low energy Van de Graaff generator doing low energy nuclear physics. And big machines like that break down a lot. And when they're running well, you stay there and take data. You know, you don't stop for the night and go to bed. You just keep taking data as long as that machine's working till you have all the data you need. So in any case, I started the meditation, found out some 3 months later into my meditation that I could debug software in my mind. I could think about my decks of cards. This back in the old days when you had punch cards to tell a computer what to do. And I'd have 4 or 5 cards with like, I think it was 1,000 or 2,000 cards in each box. And trying to debug was hard in those days. There weren't debuggers and things that help isolate where the problem was. All of it, that didn't happen. All you got is a message that your job didn't run. That's all the information you'd get, and you'd have to try to figure out why. So it was hard to debug, and I brought up my code and looked at it, and the lines that had problems in it just stood right out to me, and I checked them out, and sure enough, those lines of code had problems in them. But I didn't get it through any normal means. I got it through some other non-normal means, through some paranormal means. And that just blew me away because I'm a physicist, and we physicists tend to be materialists. We tend to have very small minds when it comes to the larger sense of reality. And you know what I was working under was what's called a operational definition of reality, and that is if you can't operate on it, which means if you can't measure it, if you can't interact with it, then it either, and that means physically interact with it, then it either doesn't exist or it's not significant. And the idea is, well, if you can't interact with the thing, then that's as good as nothing being there at all. If you can't interact with it, it's of no interest. So that really piqued my interest as a physicist. What physics is modeling reality. Would be a good definition of physics, is how do you model reality? And of course, physics usually models reality with math, but understanding reality and how it works and being able to model it is what I was about. And I suddenly realized there was another big piece of reality that I didn't know anything about. This reality that had to do strictly with mind and not with the physical world. And that it was real and just as real as the one that we call the physical world. I could do things there. I could debug my software. And not only debug software, you might say, well, deep in my subconscious, I knew that line was wrong, and it really wasn't anything going on. But that's not the case, because some of the things that were wrong were things that had nothing to do with me. The key punch that punched holes in the cards was just off a little bit. So I could look at that card and I could say, looks right. I can't find an error with it, but the job would still bomb. So I'd take that card out and replace it with one that looked just like it, and it would work fine. So it was off so little that you couldn't tell with the eyeball, but the machine that read the data knew that something was wrong. So it had errors like that. I could find errors even like that couldn't come out of my subconscious in any normal kinds of way. So it had to be another property of reality, another facet of reality I didn't know anything about. So from then on, I was very interested in learning about this reality and understanding it. What else could I do there? And why did it work? And how did it work? And how could you explain it? What was the underlying science behind it? What was it really? So I had that going on in my mind, these big questions, but didn't have much of a way of finding answers. So it was more questions, but very few answers to those questions, until I happened to bump into Bob Monroe. That's kind of a longer story, but I'll just make it very short. Place where I worked had read his book, Journeys Out of the Body, found out that he lived only about a 45-minute drive from the city we lived in. So we all went to see Bob Monroe, and just to see what the guy was like. And I wanted to see whether he actually was kind of straightforward or whether he was just, hustling books. So I didn't know. But after talking with him, it was obvious that he was very straightforward. Matter of fact, he even had an engineer's kind of mindset. He was very methodical, rational, logical, straightforward. And he also had a lot of money. He was wealthy. So he wasn't trying to, earn an extra $10,000 by selling, strange books. That obviously was not what he was trying to do. He didn't need the income from books. He was publishing those books because it was an experience of his, and he decided that other people were having experiences, and he just wanted to give other people kind of something that made them feel that that they weren't all alone, because he felt alone. When he had those experiences, he thought, am I going crazy? Is this an insanity? What's happening? He went to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, there's nothing wrong with you. These are just things you're experiencing. So go play with it. Find out, what you can about it. So he did. So he started a diary. And that's basically what his book was. It was his diary that he had started with all of his experiences in the non-physical. So anyway, Bob had just built a lab to study consciousness. Didn't have anybody to man it, didn't know what to do in it. Like him, he had a lot of questions, but no answers. So he built this lab, and I showed up, and another friend of mine that was there also with this group. who was an electrical engineer. We told him we would be his scientists and design and make some equipment for studying what we could study, things we could measure, galvanic skin response, EEG measurements on a mine. We would try to build all these things, high voltage voltmeters for measuring current flowing through the body. So we got all that equipment together and made it. And the deal was that we'd do that for Bob and do all the experiments we could think of. And he would teach us how to go out of body, because if it was only about somebody else, well, that's interesting. But you can't learn as much if it's you. So we both were aware that if it wasn't our truth, if we didn't understand it, if we didn't experience it, then it was always looking at somebody else or some other thing. We never really would understand it. So he agreed. So we'd go out to the lab and we'd work and do things for a couple hours, and Bob would come up and we'd get in these booths. He had some acoustically isolated booths, and then he would try to teach us, about going out of body. So we did that with Bob for, it was pretty much that way for about 5 years, and maybe 15 to 20 hours a week we were spending with Bob, 2 or 3 days during the week, and then weekends. So we were both serious about it because we were learning, we were growing, we were finding out about other reality frames and generating data that said this indeed is actual. It's factual. We could remote view and then check on what we remote viewed and see is that what was there. And most of the time it was. And then of course we had to understand, well, why did it not work sometimes? Because sometimes it didn't work. We got things wrong. And why was that? And what was the variables that changed that made it so we didn't get it? So I was the theorist, because I'm the physicist, and that's what physics is. It's basically theory of reality. So my job was to try to understand it, come up with a model of how did it work and why did it work, and explain it. My friend, the Double E, he kind of designed and built equipment. We all did, but he was kind of the leader of that part. And Bob was our teacher. So yes, for about 5 years, 15 to 20 hours a week, we worked on understanding this thing. And eventually, Dennis came up with the concept of binaural beats. He found it in an old Scientific American, and he said, well, let's try that, see if that helps, see if that works. And it did work. So eventually Bob got a patent on it, called it Hemisync, binaural beats with some of his own sounds that he put in it. And it became so popular that Dennis and I started being trainers more than researchers, because everybody was coming to Monroe's place and they wanted to experience this and learn. And then we built this big audio harness that would spread it out to like 20, 30 people. And we were traveling places and people would come. And so there was a big demand for it. And that's when Bob got the idea of forming the Monroe Institute, because so many people were interested. So that triggered him to form this Monroe Institute and actually build a facility, and not just have Dennis and I fly around to different places and do this. And Dennis and I got tired of that. We enjoyed the research, but being trainers got old after a while. It was good in the beginning because it gave us a lot of subjects that we could still collect data, but it got pretty old. So both of us kind of slipped out the back and trained other people, who then took over the kind of things we were doing as trainers, and we kind of left. So that whole run was probably maybe 7 years worth of connection with Bob Monroe and that work. The first 5 were just learning with Bob, and the last couple were as trainers. So that's how a nice physicist like me got to be such a in such a weird place for a physicist, which is studying consciousness. So I did eventually, even after I left Monroe's, I kept working on it, because you can't start down this path and then walk away from it. It's not like that. This is something that once you understand a little bit about, you have to understand more. At least if you're a scientist, that's the way I am. So I kept working on it for about the next 35 years, trying to do science. I mean, it's basically doing science. You'd let's say, remote view, and then you change your variable, the way you approached it. You know, your state of mind, your state of consciousness. You change your variable, see how it changed the result, and then change another variable, hold all the rest of them constant. So it's just typical science where you keep, all the variables as still as you can, unchanging, and just change one and see the effect that one variable has on the result, and then change a different variable. And it's very tedious work. You have to work at it, hours every day over years and years and years. But eventually, after doing that, I thought I had a pretty good idea of how it worked and why it didn't, and how some people were better at it than others, and what the fundamentals were. So I decided I would write it down. And then when I started to write it down, I realized there was a lot of details that were still kind of fuzzy in my mind, because when it's all in your mind, you accept fuzzy thinking and don't notice it. But when you're forced to write it down, fuzzy sentences just leap off the page at you and say, that's just terrible. You have to be more concise. You have to be more, you have to come to a good explanation here. You can't just have a fuzzy idea. Well, I know it sort of works like this, so we'll just go on, and that's what happens inside your head, but it doesn't work when you write. So as I wrote it down, I found lots of little places where I need to fill in the dots between this spot and that spot and understand it. So the writing process took 5 years, and part of that was me learning, doing more experiments, because once I had a little thing that I needed to understand better, then I would just work on understanding that, do more research, understanding that. And then once I'd get past that, I'd go on to the next thing. So I'd published the books in 2003 in English. I do have the books now that are published in French, so I don't know whether that's where you read them or not, but...
No, I read the English one.
You read the English version?
It's a very, very challenging work, because it's a lot of... it's a big work. So to have a complete framework of your work, it's useful, but at the first reading, it's difficult after to have a sense of each details. So it's good for a first reading to read the whole, but after I think that you have to go back to it to
yes.
to pick because it's really complete. It's a big
It is.
tome.
It's very dense, yes, and there's a lot of information there, and every paragraph has some information that's necessary. I ask people to read it very slowly. And if you read it very slowly, constantly asking, how does this apply to me? How does this apply to my experience? And then when you're done, give it about 6 months at least, and then read it again. Because the second time you read it, you'll find things that are important to you, but you never saw them the first time. And if you read it a third time, you'll also find things in there that you just missed because you weren't ready for that understanding yet. And until you're ready for it, until you're ready for like a paradigm shift, you just don't see it. It just slips in one ear and out the other, and it never sticks. So yeah, I've had people read it 7, 8 times, and they still find things that surprise them. Oh, gee, that's really important. I never saw that before. Where was that? How could I miss it? So it is like that. But anyway, I published it 2003, and about 2 years later, it came to me how I could derive quantum physics from theory of consciousness. Now, I knew that had to be possible, because I knew that consciousness was fundamental. And if consciousness is fundamental, then you have to be able to derive physics from consciousness, because you derive the the less fundamental things from the more fundamental things. So I knew that was possible, but I didn't really know how to do it. But a couple of years into it, it just came to me. The aha moment came, and somebody said something that triggered that thought, and I got it. And then as soon as I got that, I said, well, gee, that's important. Now I can derive physics from consciousness. And then I thought just a little bit and said, well, what about relativity? Because that's the second big, in modern physics, you have quantum physics, you have relativity, and that kind of summarizes all of science these days. So I only took me a couple of days to think about relativity, and there was that answer. I could derive that too. So now I could derive both the sciences from consciousness. And then I started looking at all of the things in science that scientists know are true because they've done the experiments, and they can tell that this is how the world is, but they have no idea why it is that way. And there's lots of these paradoxes in physics. There's a lot of things that physics gets to, and they just don't know. So they say, well, this is the way it is, and we'll go on, but they can't tell you why. And both quantum physics and relativity have one of those paradoxes in it. And quantum physics is, why should particles be best modeled as probability distributions? That doesn't make any sense. And what's this collapse of the wave function, to the physical particle? That doesn't really make any sense either. And it's something that physicists can't explain. It's just a little bit of magic and mysticism that's stuck in the middle of their theory that they can't explain. But consciousness explains it perfectly, and not only says that it can be that way, but it has to be that way. It couldn't be any other way. And same with relativity. The mystery is, why does the speed of light always go the same velocity? Because everything else in our reality doesn't work like that. Velocities add. By that, I mean, if you're in a car and the car's going 10 miles an hour and you throw a ball forward direction of the car out the window 10 miles an hour, well, relative to the ground, the ball's going 20 miles an hour. It gets 10 miles from the velocity of the car and 10 miles from the throw, miles per hour. So they're additive, and everything in our reality works that way, except one thing, and that's light. And it doesn't matter what the source of the light is, it always goes the same speed. And it's always at the speed c is the variable that's called the speed of light. And then that's a big mystery. Why is that so? And consciousness just explains it just as easy as anything. There's a set of what they call cosmic constants, which is a set of numbers, like gravity is a common one that everybody knows about, that if you changed its value, even in the 8th or 9th decimal place, the whole universe would collapse. It wouldn't work anymore. And it turns out that the universe is a finely tuned thing. And it's got a whole set of these constants. And if any one of these constants changed in the 9th decimal place, the whole universe would become unstable. It wouldn't have lasted this long. It would have, gone away. So then the mystery is, how does it get tuned like that? When you tune something, it kind of means that somebody has done a lot of trial and error work to get it tuned just right to make it work together. And how does that happen when it's a random function, which is what materialists would think? Everything happened randomly. Well, you don't randomly end up with 5 numbers all tuned to each other, to 9 decimal places. That's not what random events look like. That's impossible. So that's just 2. And there's another one. Though the speed of light is mostly constant, there's been some records of it changing again in about the 9th decimal place. And just a little bit, could be a little bit greater, could be a little bit less. And it's changed like 4, maybe 5 times. I don't remember exactly whether it's 4 or 5, but it doesn't change much, just by a tiny little bit. And of course, why does that happen? Why is it, it goes along, and because scientists measure it like all the time. That's a kind of a standard measurement, because speed of light is how we derive some of our really basic things from. So that's constantly being measured. And they'll get a little different number. And it's not that there's error in the measurement, because you can measure it out to 15 decimal places accurately. But it's like in the 9th decimal place, it changes. So it's a real change. And that's kind of one of the secrets in physics. You know, nobody talks about that, but it's just another one of these paradoxes. And again, if you understand consciousness, you can explain all of those things just very easily, just very logically, with solid explanations. Not, well, I can see how it could happen that way, but I see how it must happen that way. You know, it's a logical deduction that it must happen that way. So anyway, that's then kind of is the last requirement in the philosophy of, let's see, what's it called? Let's see. You know, Plato's cave. What's that philosophy called? Idealism. It's called idealism.
Mm-hmm.
And then things like materialism comes under realism. So the idealism versus realism. Idealism says what you see is not necessarily all there is. There's something else behind that. And Plato gave this allegory of we're really just, our physical world is like shadows on the wall of a cave, you know, but there's something else behind that that's making the shadows. And that was idealism. And realism says, nah, what you see is what you got, and that's all there is. There isn't anything else more. Well, those two philosophies have been, you know, they're both incompatible with each other. It can't be both. It has to be one or the other. They're not compatible. It can't be some of each. So that's been kind of a philosophical war for a couple of thousand years. And, you know, this basically solves it. Idealism, the last problem, I think, in idealism was if that, you know, most idealists did get to the point eventually that big field or whatever it is that's behind the physical reality is consciousness. Most idealists got to the point that consciousness is fundamental. That's pretty much agreed, probably not 100%, but pretty much agreed by idealists that consciousness has to be the fundamental thing. Okay, but they don't know how to derive physics from consciousness. So until they can do that, then they can't really show that they've got the, you know, that they've got the more fundamental thing, that consciousness is more fundamental than stuff. So in any case, this kind of solves that problem, and the idealists are the winners of that long competition. So indeed, that is the case. And another point about this model of mine is that it explains all the things that are paranormal. So there's a logical scientific explanation for remote viewing, for mind-to-mind communications, for getting data out of the database. You know, the Hindus call that database the Akashic records. That all this information is out there somewhere, and that you can get that sort of information, like you can get information about somebody's health, you know, and other things. Everything's out there. And not only does this model say, yes, that's true, but it says why the database is out there, why the database had to exist, not how it could exist, but why it has to exist, you know, what its purpose is, and why we can access it, and how one accesses it. And so you can understand all the kind of the details about it. And does it have everything in it? No, not everything. It has a lot of stuff in it, but it doesn't have everything. It's not perfect. It doesn't have all knowledge from all time. But you can understand how it's made, how it works, and why we can access it. Things like healing with your mind, you know, that is explainable. Even things like the power of positive thinking. You know, if you think positively, then positive things tend to happen. You know, if you're positive and loving and caring, then you tend to live in that kind of a world and are happier than people who are always miserable and complaining. And it explains that. And it comes up with even an objective understanding of the subjective world. in so much as it can explain if you're unhappy or complaining, why? You know, what is it that makes you that way? Why can't you find happiness? And why can't you find satisfaction? And it tells us things like, what's our purpose here? You know, why are we here? What are we doing here? What's the purpose of this reality? And how did this reality get here? You know, and what's its function and what is our function in it? So all those kinds of big picture questions all have very factual, you know, logical answers to them. So that's kind of the nature of this. I called it a big toe because Einstein created the word toe, and that was a theory of everything. But in his mind, a theory of everything was trying to find something that would derive both quantum mechanics and relativity, because those, like I said, are the two things that make up modern physics, but they're philosophically and logically incompatible with each other. You know, each one has a view of the world that is in conflict with the other's view of the world. So Einstein and all the other scientists know that there must be something bigger, something that's above them, that from which you can derive both of them, and they're just subsets of our, you know, just two different views of our reality. But there's something else that describes our reality. So he called this a toe, a theory of everything. If he could unite quantum physics and relativity and understand what they were a part of, this bigger picture, that would be a big toe. But my theory does that, but it also understands consciousness, understands the subjective world, and a lot more. So I call it a big toe. And that's kind of fun because, you know,
Yes.
my big toe, right? It kind of makes a joke at the same time.
Yes. And to ask a very fundamental question, what is consciousness and how does it relate to the nature of existence? How is it that consciousness that is fundamental?
Okay. I define consciousness as awareness with a choice. But of course, there's logical consequences to the word awareness and to the word choice. Some of the logical consequences to the word choice is that if there is a choice, then it must be a free will choice, because that's the only kind of choice there is. If you don't have free will, then there is no choice. The opposite of free will is determinism, and in determinism, there are no choices. Everything just is. Determinism is like a null set. You know, nothing can change, because if you had change, then you'd have before and after the change. You'd have to have time. You know, and in determinism, there is no time. In determinism, there is no free will because everything is done. There are no choices. And in determinism, there is no consciousness because consciousness requires free will and time. So consciousness makes choices. It's awareness with a choice. So when we have choice, that immediately brings up time and free will. So consciousness, time, and free will all are logically necessary for each other. If you don't have free will, then you can't have consciousness. If you don't have time, then you can't have consciousness. See, there is no consciousness if everything's just done. Nothing evolves, nothing changes. No, there is no learning, there is no evolution. Everything is just fixed and never changes. So there's nothing happening. Everything's static and dead. Nothing's living. Everything's just static and dead in that world of determinism. So with consciousness, then you must have free will, you must have time. Now, the word awareness, if we try to pull that apart, you know, what does awareness mean? Well, awareness, you'd have to say aware of what? Awareness is aware of something. Well, what are we aware of? Well, right now I'm aware that I'm sitting here looking at my monitor and I have a picture of me and a picture of you, and I've got curtains in the background covering windows and a clock and lights, and I'm aware of all of these things because it's visual. I'm aware of my own voice. And I'm aware of your voice when you talk because of hearing. Plus, I can feel the chair. Plus, I can, it has some smell. I've got all these senses. Well, what is that? That is just information. That's just data. And I've got 5 senses, and each of my senses collect data. And that's what awareness is. It's an ability to have input and collect data on yourself and your surroundings. That's awareness. You can be aware of yourself and aware of your surroundings by collecting data, by collecting information. Now, the information I collect through my senses comes in, let's say with sight, there's photons, it goes through my eyeball, gets to a retina. The retina then turns it into electrical pulse, and the electrical pulse runs down a nerve, and it shuffles, neurons, it synapses, and does whatever it does down there in the brain. But it's just data. By the time it gets to the brain, it's just data, neurons, electrical signals, that sort of thing. Now we take all that data and we interpret that data into what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we feel. We learn to interpret that data as an infant. When we're an infant, we learn things. Oh, that's mommy, that's an apple, that's the house I live in, this is Photo, my dog. And they, you learn how to interpret it. We do the same thing when we play video games. We get a data stream from a computer. That data stream lights up, say, 1 million pixels on our monitor as 1 million dots of light. We look at 1 million dots of light and we say, oh, there's rivers, there's streams, there's people, and they're dressed this way and that way, and they live in houses and cars. And we get all this information because we interpret 1 million different dots of light. Each one has a position, an intensity, and a color. That's it. That's all the information. We get 1 million intensities, colors, and positions. And we look at all that stuff and we interpret it as our physical world, or the physical world that's the computer is sending. Maybe it's a virtual reality. We interpret it as a virtual world. So what is awareness? It's an ability to receive information, receive data, and turn that data into information, to understand it. And that is just what awareness is. Now, awareness sounds kind of computer-like, doesn't it? You get input data, and then you process that input data and come up with a reality that data describes. So I model consciousness as an information system. Okay, it's an information system with a choice. So what's consciousness? It's awareness with a choice. Okay, so it has time, it has free will. So if you have awareness with a choice, and if you look at that as an information system, then you'll realize that all the things that are typically in our information systems are required here, like memory. If you didn't have any memory, then every piece of data you got would be the first piece of data you ever had gotten. Every new thing you saw would be the first time you'd ever seen anything. And there'd be no continuity. There'd be no way to really make many choices about it. You'd have no sense of anything being connected to anything else. You just have a series of unrelated things. So you need memory in order to make choices. Be aware. So this information system has to have memory. It has to have feedback, because choices require purpose. If there is no purpose, then all the choices are kind of random. They're not going anywhere. They're not focused to any particular direction. So you have to have a purpose of some sort. You can't just be there, being there for no particular reason. Now, if you had a computer that didn't have any particular reason, it wouldn't do anything. You have to give it directions. That's what programming is for. The programming is its reasons to do things. Do this, then do that, then do this other thing. But it has to have some sort of direction. so that it can decide what it should do next. Okay, so information systems have to have memory. They have to have some feedback because, okay, you have purpose and I made a choice, but am I getting closer to my purpose or farther away from my purpose? So I have to be able to assess, make that assessment. I need some feedback. So here I've changed. Is the change a good change or a bad change? Should I do more of that or less of that? You see? So all of those things sound like a computer. You need feedback, you need input, you need to process the input, you need memory, and it all has to be guided in some particular direction for some particular purpose. So it's not just randomness, because randomness can never build. Random things don't build anything. Randomness just keeps flying off in different random directions and can't actually accumulate any knowledge or accumulate any understanding or meet any purpose or any function. So you have to have this purpose. So with all of that, then I model consciousness as an information system. It deals with information. And I make a distinction between information and data. Information is non-physical. Data is physical. So let's take a book. We all would say, well, there's a book, and a book has a lot of information in it. But that's because we use the word information very generally. We're not too specific about the way we use words. So, but if you look at that book, you'd say, well, the book is physical. The paper is physical. The ink is physical. It's a physical thing. But the book is not the information. Oh, right, the book contains information. But the physical part of the book is just ink and paper. That's what the book is, and that's physical. The information is the understanding of what those ink squiggles mean. You know, it's the comprehension of the significance, of the meaning of what's in the book, of those code symbols that are in ink in the book. So it takes a consciousness to have information. Only a consciousness can have information. But now the book is really data. And the book is a media, the paper is a media that holds data. And the ink is a way of encoding the data. You know, so that's what we pass. Well, that's the way it is in a computer. A computer sends data around, comes up with answers or whatever, but it's just data. It's not information until somebody looks at that data and says, oh, here's what this means. This is the message. This is the significance of that. And that takes a consciousness. So information only exists within a consciousness. Data can exist in a physical world outside of consciousness. It can exist by itself. Data takes up space, has weight, you know, is physical stuff. And we can move data around. I can take data and send it to you, just like I can send you a data signal that has 1 million pixels in it. And you can look at that data and you decode it by looking at all those millions of pixels and interpreting, what does that mean? But see, it takes a consciousness to do that. As long as it's just 1 million pixels, it's just 1 million dots of light. Doesn't mean anything in particular until the consciousness looks at it and says, oh, look, rivers and people and things and buildings and, you know, all the stuff. And we can tell what's going on and who's doing what to who. All of that is the interpretation of the data and requires a consciousness. Okay, so I see that the thing that's fundamental in existence is consciousness. Consciousness is an information system. It has memory, it has processing, it has purpose. So let's look at what would be the purpose of consciousness. That's kind of where we should go next. And if we look at the purpose, well, let's think of an information system, and I can just define the word bit means the smallest unit of information. What's the smallest piece of information possible? Okay, and then I'll just name that a bit. All right, now if all the bits in this information system are random, there's no information in the information system, right? If you get a system and all the bits are random, then there's no meaning there. That's what it means to be random. There's no order to it. So if that system took some of those random bits and ordered them into some specific order, it would have created information out of randomness. Now those ordered bits could symbolize something. They could stand for something. Just like those dots of light symbolize things and stand for things. So you could say, oh, okay, well, this little bunch of bits, that means this, and I have another bunch of bits over here, and that's another one of those. And oh, look, 1 + 1 is 2. So we get quantity in our little bits of order. There's quantities among those things, and so math develops, arithmetic, addition develops, and of course multiplication and all the rest of that's just really addition. In one sense, all the computer does is it's a big adding machine, and it can just add very, very quickly. Multiplication is just a lot of fast adding. It's a kind of a different nomenclature, but it's all about adding. How many are in 7 groups of 8? 7 groups of 8, and it's just about adding. You can take 7 groups of 8 things and count them all up, add them all up, and you get answers. So division is really about that too. So we see that an information system making things that are ordered rather than random creates information, and it can give, because it's conscious, it can give those ordered bits meaning and significance. They can be metaphors or symbols. So we measure disorder with a word called entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder. So when all the bits are random, that's the highest entropy that system can have. That's maximum entropy. When it orders some bits, now that just lowered the entropy a little bit of that system. Okay, now if the bits are just ordered like in a pattern, up, down, up, well, what's next? It's going to be down, because we've got a pattern going on here. So it has information in that pattern. I can tell you what comes next. Give me any point in that pattern, I can tell you what the next one is. You see, there's information within the pattern. So it can make patterns and patterns of patterns. It can make all sorts of things, but that in itself is ordering bits. But if those patterns have significance and meaning, that lowers entropy even more. That's more order. It's order within mind. It's order with understanding. It's order within consciousness. And that's what we're talking about here with the entropy. We're talking about entropy in consciousness, not necessarily entropy amongst children's blocks. It's low entropy within consciousness. So this system, if we reduce, the way my model works is I take this idea of consciousness and I reduce it to the smallest piece of consciousness you can get. What is that smallest piece of consciousness? And it would be something that was just aware of only of itself and I guess its environment, but it was only aware of 2 things, and that is that it could be in this way or it could be that way. It could somehow change from this to that. So there was an awareness of that ability to change. Okay, that's a choice. It could choose to be in A, it could choose to be in B. Well, it could choose to be a 1, it could choose to be a 0. And it also could choose to be an A and then a B and then an A and then a B, and now it's generated regular time. It's just made a metronome. It can measure time by flipping back between those states, and it can make choices. So it's a little piece of consciousness. Remember, it has to have time, it has to have choice to be conscious. So this can't get any smaller. If you reduced that anymore, it wouldn't be conscious anymore. So that's the smallest piece. Now, how does that piece evolve? Well, it evolves by lowering its entropy. Information systems evolve by lowering their entropy, making more order, more structure, more lines. A one and then another one, then a zero, and then a one, and then a zero, and then a zero. And well, ones and zeros make sense if you understand base 2. You know, you can start building things in base 2. You can start building math and arithmetic and addition. So you have this little piece of consciousness, and it evolves by making better patterns, more meaningful and significant patterns to itself. It's just significant to itself. It helps it order things better. Okay, and then it can make sequences because it can use that one and a zero as a metronome. It can make, now that has regular time. It always had time, but now it has regular time that it can measure with a metronome. That's different. Now it can make orderly sequences, and sequences of patterns of sequences of patterns of patterns of sequences. You know, it can build this stuff up to be very complex if it likes, as long as it gives meaning and significance to these things. It's learning and it's growing. So it does this, and it evolves greatly, but it gets to a point where it's just not evolving very much anymore. In the beginning, it's just evolving like crazy. You know, I mean, it's just all these possibilities that it could do. There's almost unlimited possibilities. But then it kind of has done all the possibilities it could think of, and it's kind of running out of new possibilities to work with. So the only thing that it can do, and that it has to do, is that it can take a piece of itself and give that, of course, that piece of itself now will also have free will. It's a little piece of consciousness. And now it can interact with another piece of consciousness with free will. That makes all kinds of new possibilities because they both have free will and they don't have to agree on things. Now you have two separate points of view that can interact. And then you can take more of those. And now you can make 100,000 of them. And each one of them has its own point of view, its own viewpoint, its own set of experiences. It's interacted with each other, you know, with the system. And it's done that from its beginning. And as time goes by, they separate in experience because all of them don't experience the same things or the same things in the same order or come to the same conclusions when they're looking at these ordered things. They have to interpret what it means. They're little pieces of consciousness. They interpret, and everybody doesn't interpret it the same way. Some people see it one way. Some, you know, these pieces of consciousness see it one way. Some see it another. So pretty soon they spread in their opinions and in their thought processes. And now the possibilities that all these independent pieces of consciousness, what can they do together? Well, that's a lot bigger. There's a lot more possibilities for the group than there was for just a single monolithic piece of consciousness. So that's how it has to evolve. And if you think about it, that's exactly the same path that evolution has to take, say, with our biology, right? We started out with single-celled things, bacteria. Well, single-celled things, they were pretty nifty and they could do a lot of things, but they were very limited too. So what was the evolution? Oh, multi-celled things, you know, a couple of cells had to work together. Not just one cell, but cells had to cooperate, interact with each other. And then you got multi-celled things. So now you have amoebas that not only, you know, it's not just a bacteria, it's got inside parts. You know, it's got a nucleus, it's got the parts that move it around, it's got different kinds of things that do different things, and jellyfish and fish and reptiles and mammals and then us. So all of that grows, but all you need to start it is a single, simple living cell, and you can get everything else evolved from it. Well, this is the same way. You just start with this one simple cell of consciousness, which is this minimum piece of consciousness, and just logically see how the evolution has to go in order for it to go on. So, all right, now I call all these little pieces of consciousness individuated units of consciousness. They're just little subsets. And if you maintain the computer metaphor, then they're called virtual machines. In a computer, virtual machines are another computer kind of emulated inside the big computer. So you have a big computer, and that big computer takes a little bit of its memory, a little bit of its processing, all of that, puts it all together in a package that what are called partitions, partitions itself off from the rest of the computer. And now that's called a virtual computer within a computer. So you can think of this now as an information system with lots of little virtual machines inside of it. So it all is one thing. We are all one, that's true. And the one thing we are is consciousness. But at the same time, we are individuated subsets of that piece of consciousness. That's also true. So we're individual in the sense that we each have free will and our own experience base, and we're unique. But we're all one in the sense that we're all just part of the same piece of consciousness. You see, so that's the way this works. Now, the next step is, it was probably one of the best steps that I made. When I got to this point, I said, that's just perfect. I had no idea that this would derive out this way, but now we have a social system, right? We have all these individual units of consciousness, a social system. When you have a social system, and we have all these consciousness are trying to lower entropy. That's what they do. That's how they evolve. So the whole system has to evolve. But as the pieces evolve, then the whole system evolves. So because a piece is a part of the system. So if one little piece lowers its entropy, then the whole system lowers its entropy just a little bit. So that's the name of the game. That's what they're doing. So let's say now we have a social system. How does a social system minimize its entropy? It's obvious how a social system does that. And the way I show that is I said, we'll take two social systems, exactly identical social systems, and let one social system, or let them both be given the same amount of resources. So you got 10,000 people. Let's call them people. It's easier to do if we get concrete. It's easier for people's minds to think if it's concrete. So let's give them 10,000 people each, and they have a certain number of resources that they can deal with. All right, and then you're just going to let them go and see what they do with their resources. Okay, now, one of them we'll call, that's the love group, and the other one's the fear group. Now, so they could do anything they want, but I'm going to do the two dynamics. There could be a mix of these two dynamics in any amounts, but I'm just going to isolate these two dynamics. Over on the love side, they cooperate. They cooperate because they care about each other. Everybody's important to everybody else. So if somebody comes up with a good idea, they share it. If somebody finds a better way to do things, or finds processes that work better, they share them, and they all work. So if somebody's barn burns down, everybody gets together and builds them a new barn. Everybody's trying to help everybody else. Now, so that group will just work with their resources, and so just kind of imagine what that group would be like. Say we'll stop the experiment in 100 years. In 100 years, we'll stop, see what those 10,000 people, what they did. Well, in the fear group over here, because they have fear, they're self-centered. They're all self-focused. Fear makes you self-centered. And fear also creates ego and creates beliefs. If you have fear, you don't have trust. You're fearful that somebody else is going to take the little stuff that you've already got. And you'd like to have the stuff that other people have because you're self-centered. So you and some of your friends get together and say, oh, hey, we'll all get together, and then we can take the stuff away from those people that aren't together, And of course, then those other people group up too. And now you got these gangs that are fighting each other. And pretty soon this ends up in what we call the warlord mentality, where there's somebody at the top, and then a couple of smaller groups underneath them, and smaller, progressively bigger groups, and then everybody else, the peasants, are on the bottom. That's the way that eventually works out. Because if somebody there finds something good, a better idea, they hide it. They keep it for themselves, because how are they going to turn this into profit for them? That's what's important. So anyhow, at the end, what you have is the love group has optimized its resources for everyone. The fear group, you have a warlord mentality going on, and 3% of the people own 95% of all the stuff, all the resources. And it's very hierarchical, and it's full of fear, distrust, violence, and the basic problem is, how do you get stuff, and how do you keep it and keep other people from taking it away from you? That's kind of the nature of existence is like that. It's all about the stuff and being able to hang on to it. And to get more stuff, you have to take it away from other people. There's only so much stuff. Remember, the stuff was a set amount of resources. So there's only so much stuff. So it's competition for the stuff there. And it always ends up in a warlord mentality. So now look at those two, and which one's the high entropy and which one's the low entropy? Well, it's just as obvious as anything. The people who cooperate and work together have a low entropy. They've all decided how they can optimize the resources for everybody's benefit. And on the other side, you got a bunch of people who are all self-centered, all trying to figure out ways that they can get more stuff for themselves and their friends and their people, their families, whatever. It's all us against them kind of a mentality. And it's very unequal, with a few at the top and most everybody else at the bottom. A few very wealthy and a lot of peasants that are, that have to do all the work. So that's the difference. And that's a very high entropy. Now, in that warlord mentality, it can never get very high, because let's say it organizes itself. Well, everybody wants to be in that top spot. So that guy in that top spot usually doesn't survive very long. He gets knocked down and somebody else crawls up in that top spot, and he doesn't last very long either, because there's lots and lots of people who would rather have that top spot than the lesser spot that they have. So everybody's trying to claw their way up that hill, but there's just so much stuff. So there's just one hill. So everybody's scrambling up, people are falling down, and it's just this constant grind of trying to survive and do better than the next guy. So that's very high entropy. You don't share, you don't care, you only care for maybe your group, but even within your group, you don't really trust those people unless your group's under attack, and then you all band together to, it's that sort of thing. So what does that mean? That means that here we are, we're consciousness. Consciousness evolves by lowering its entropy. So consciousness, if it raises its entropy, it's de-evolving. If it continues to de-evolve, it dies. All the bits go random and there is no information anymore. So it's just like we are in a sense. It has to evolve to live. If it de-evolves, it dies. So it's trying to evolve and keeps trying to do better, optimize all the possibilities that all those millions, billions of individuated consciousness interacting with each other. How can they interact in a way that optimizes for everyone? So that tells you what your purpose is here. You're here. Everybody's purpose is, and the larger conscious system purpose is, to evolve toward becoming love. It's all about caring, sharing, cooperating, asking what can I do and how can I help, rather than what's in it for me and how can I get what you've got. That's the mindset. So that tells us what our purpose is here. Now we can look at one more thing is, well, what about this reality? What is this reality and how did it get here? What's this physical universe? Well, when the system generated all these individuated units of consciousness, it was like a big chat room. The first virtual reality was just communication protocols, language, so they could communicate effectively with each other. It wasn't just one monolithic thing, being aware in its own mind, it had to communicate. Now, a virtual reality is just defined by a rule set. Here's Here's a set of rules, and in this space, you abide by these rules. That creates a little reality. That's all the Sims are, the World of Warcraft. It's a set of rules. That's called programming. The program is the rules, right? That's the set of rules. So virtual reality is created by creating rules. If you don't have any rules, then there's no context by which you can have experience. Rules create context, which create experience. Okay, so if I was just to say, well, okay, Ludovic, let's play a game. You go first. Go ahead. You wouldn't know what to do because there aren't any rules. Say, well, what are the rules, right? What's the game? What's the point? What are the rules? As soon as I make a bunch of rules, then suddenly you can come up with strategies. You can come up with plans. You can have experience. You can interact. But until there's rules, you can't have a game because interaction requires rules. There's rules within interaction. How do two people interact with each other? Well, in this reality we call the physical universe, we interact with each other physically. But that's rules. And what are the rules? Physics, chemistry, biology. That's the rules of this game. So here we have consciousness. It just made all the individuated units of consciousness, and it's just created a virtual reality in communication protocols so they can all communicate with each other. But it's not really a good learning place. It doesn't make much of a schoolhouse because there aren't very many, what should we say, important choices. Remember, you evolve by the choices you make. Choice is there, so if you make low entropy choices, you evolve. You make high entropy choices, you de-evolve. But there's just not a lot of meaningful choices. There's a lot of choices, but they're not all that meaningful. You can pretend to be anything, anybody, you're just a big chat room. That's my model for that. So it's like there's a huge chat room and there's, 1 million people in a chat room, no rules other than the fact that we know how to chat. All right, well, that's not a very good schoolhouse. There's a lot of randomness. There's a lot of, there's not much to get a hold of there. So the system did that for a while, and it did evolve for a while, but then again, it kind of hit a plateau, and the system says, I need a better virtual reality other than just communication protocols. I need something that creates more interactive experience that's moral experience, ethical experience, life and death experience, experiences that have consequences, not the hardly any consequences at all being in a big chat room. Anytime you want, you can just turn it off and leave, and so what? There's not a lot of consequences. So what it did is it said, well, you have to have rules, and you have to have some initial conditions. A game is like that too. Here are the rules, but here are the pieces, and here's the deck of cards, and there's some initial conditions you have to have. There needs to be a table to play on and a few other things. So it said, here's some rules and here's some initial conditions, and I'll just let the initial conditions change according to the rules and create a virtual reality that way. See what happens. So it came up with some initial conditions and some rules and hit the run button, and the initial conditions changed according to the rules, and it created something, but it really wasn't what it wanted. So it said, well, let's change the rules a little bit. Let's change the initial conditions a little bit. We'll try it again. Well, you probably are guessing now that if we're going to build up this virtual reality we call the physical universe, those initial conditions are like a little ball of plasma with a real tight, all in a short, small spot with a lot of pressure and high temperature. And the rules are what we call physics and chemistry and biology. And when you push the run button, well, according to the rules, that very high pressure in that plasma is going to expand. And as it expands, it cools because that's part of the rules. And now we're talking a big digital bang, right? It's like the Big Bang, but it's the Big Bang in a computer. It's a simulation. And it lets that evolve until it evolves this, what we call the physical universe. Okay, so it does this physical universe, and then a planet like Earth happens to grow things like critters and amoebas and jellyfish and fish and lizards and us. And now we have this simulation with simulated characters all being played by consciousness. So they're all NPCs, non-player characters, if you think of a virtual reality. And the larger conscious system is playing all of them according to their nature. And their nature is according to how they evolve, what they can do, So now we have this simulation that wasn't programmed, it was evolved. Now, one thing I'll say is that it took a lot of trial and error to get that. It had to go, okay, big digital bang, take 10,000, and each time you fiddle a little bit with the initial conditions, fiddle a little bit with the rules to make it a little more stable and last. And that's why we have these bunch of cosmic consciousnesses that are all tuned to 9 decimal places with each other, because eventually the system tuned all that so it would get a simulation that would be stable long enough for us to evolve. Okay, so critters evolve, and critters have consciousness too. Dogs, cats, and horses and lizards all have consciousness. They're aware, they make choices. Their decision space is not so large. The number of choices they have is not as great as ours, but they make choices. So, but those weren't really great choice makers either. It was all it was more instinct than it was, based on the program, on the evolution. So we finally get the people. That's a good, a lot of choices there, opposable thumbs and all that. We can build things, we can do all sorts of stuff. So the system starts to encourage individuated units of consciousness to play one of the characters. It's been playing all the characters. So it says, okay, play Tom Campbell here. And a little piece of consciousness goes out and plays this infant that's going to be Tom Campbell, or is called Tom Campbell. So that's the way it happens. And the mechanics there is that the individuated unit of consciousness itself partitions off a piece of itself that has no memory, just its quality of consciousness that it's gained up to that point. In other words, its entropy level. What entropy has it evolved to? What entropy level has it evolved to at that point? So I call lower entropy just a higher quality of consciousness. So it's got this higher quality of consciousness, just that. It takes that, partitions that off, and now that is going to make all the choices for this infant. And at first, all the infant can do is kick its mom inside, kick it inside of its mom's belly. It can see lights come and go. It can hear voices. It can hear music. And it's getting a sense of its environment. It knows it's in this liquid thing. It can do somersaults. And it's picking up mind-to-mind communication from its parents and from other things in its environment. It's connected, okay? And then it's born, and then it learns what apples are and homes and dogs and everything. It understands, what the data means. It's getting a data stream, and it begins to learn what all the data in the data stream, how to interpret them. At least it learns the interpretation that works. If you interpretate this as an apple, well, they're good to eat. This is a rock. It's not good to eat. So you get its attributes, and all that just comes with learning. So you'll learn how to interpret the data. All right. So that is then us. Okay. We are really free will awareness units making choices for a virtual reality that wasn't programmed, but evolved. And it evolved just as a source of interaction and choices for us. Do we have a richer set of choices to make than we had in a big chat room? Because now our evolution really can grow. Because now our choices from the get-go are like life and death. I can't live without food. I have children I have to take care of. And we have all of these very meaningful, very important choices that drive us. And everything that we do affects other people.
Mm.
You know, if I run out and I grab that bunch of berries and I gobble them all up myself, then there aren't any left for my children. Maybe they die, you see. So there's consequences to everything that I do. What I do affects other people. What they do affects me. So now we're in this social system.
Mm.
And what's the point? We're supposed to evolve, become love and cooperative and caring. But in the beginning, we don't have any of that because we've just been in a big chat room and we haven't evolved our potential. Our potential's just sitting there largely unevolved because all we've done is been in a big chat room. So finally we get in a place where it's highly interactive and we see stuff we want, we grab it. Somebody else has it, we hit them over the head and we take it because it's all about us, because we just haven't evolved to the point that it's about other yet. And you don't just start there, you have to figure that out. And in the beginning, the most obvious thing is to take what you want, if you're big enough and strong enough to do that. So that's where we start, and we have to evolve. And we've been doing that now for about 200,000 years. We've been evolving as human beings, trying to lower our entropy, raise the quality of our consciousness. And when this avatar dies, we get another one.
Mm.
When that avatar dies, we get another one, because what we're trying to do is change ourselves to be a more caring person. We're not trying to change our behavior so much. I mean, but nice behavior is good. It's civilizing, but it doesn't help you grow up. In other words, we don't want to be a whole bunch of people that act kind. We want to be a whole bunch of people that are kind. And there's a big difference. So it's a matter of being that way. So we have to change who we are. We have to become kind and caring.
How can one do that?
Well, one does that by getting rid of their fear. Fear is the opposite of love. Love is about other. Fear is about self. Those two are the opposites each other. It's not love and hate, it's love and fear are the two opposite things. So we do that by getting rid of our fear. It's our fear that creates that self-centeredness, that selfishness, that's all about me-ness. I want to climb up the ladder over the heads of other people. I have to be clever and get ahead, rather than how can I help us all get there? You see, it's the fear that drives all of that. So if you look at all the dysfunction in humanity, all the things in humanity that are not nice, that are negatives and not positive, they all come from fear. Fear is the root cause of all of it. So most of us are full of fear. Most of us have a hard time going even for a day without being negative.
Mm.
Now, being negative means you get angry, you get upset, you get annoyed, you feel not appreciated, you feel abused or used, or it's my turn now, not somebody else's turn, or I should get things, or it's all about us, and all that's negative stuff. And most people really don't even get through an hour without being negative, complaining. That's negative. Even stress, for the most part, is negative. And if you get rid of fear and anxiety and stress and anger and all of that stuff, you're happy.
Mm.
So you don't have to learn how to be love. All you have to do is learn how to get rid of your fear.
Mm.
Once you get rid of your fear, you are love. That's what's left, because fear is the cause of the ego and the cause of the problems and the self-centeredness. So master your fear, get rid of your fear, and you evolve yourself spiritually. See, we're consciousness, we're non-physical beings. Now look at the way that works. If you look at a virtual reality, And I like to use World of Warcraft as an example, because that's about one of the only couple I know. And I know those because my sons and daughters played them. And I watched them play. I've probably got logged many hours watching my kids play World of Warcraft and Sims and a couple of other things, Sim Tower and a few things that they had. But if you look at that, and if you realize that our bodies are the avatar, who we actually are is a consciousness, a piece of consciousness. Okay, well, think of you're playing a game of World of Warcraft, and your player is an elf or a barbarian. Let's say you're this barbarian. Well, your barbarian doesn't do anything if you don't tell it what to do, if you don't make choices for it. You, the consciousness, are making the choices for this barbarian. You don't make any choices, it just stands there and wobbles. It doesn't do anything. You want it to run, you want it to fight, you want it to jump up and down, you want it to dance. You have to tell it. You have to make the choice. So you make all the choices for that character. Otherwise, the character does nothing. All right. And from that character's viewpoint, from the barbarian's viewpoint, where is the server? Where's the computer? It's not in the World of Warcraft. It's non-physical. The computer's non-physical from the viewpoint of the barbarian. And what about the player? The player is also non-physical from the viewpoint of the barbarian. And we know the player and the computer have to be in the same reality frame because they're constantly communicating with each other. The player tells the computer, I want my character to dance. And that causes an issue because they're in a fight and your player's dancing instead of fighting. So things happen. It's interactive. So you get feedback from the computer. Oh, you just got run over because you were dancing instead of fighting. And then you have to make another choice. Oh, I got to run back to the graveyard and get all my stuff. So it's a constant interaction between the player and the computer. So the computer and the player have to be of the same stuff, of the same, built out of the same stuff. Well, they are. They're both consciousness, you see, and they have to be able to communicate. They have to be in the same reality frame. And they're both non-physical from the viewpoint of the avatar. So here we are now, all right, Tom Campbell, the avatar. From my point of view, consciousness is non-physical. From my point of view, the computer's non-physical. The player's non-physical. You see? And there's lots of things that make sense when you understand this that don't make sense otherwise. Okay, if I'm a barbarian and I'm a real smart barbarian and I want to know where did my World of Warcraft first start? So I'm going to go back in time, and I'll look at all the records and I can say, okay, here's, I'm going back, and that was, I go through past lives backwards and I'm going back, and I'll finally get to a point where it just started. There wasn't anything before that, and then there it is. It just happened. Okay, well, that's the nature of a virtual reality. That was when the World of Warcraft first started generating data and players, came into it, right? And before that, it wasn't anything. Well, what do physicists tell us? Where did it start? Oh, it started with this ball of plasma. Where'd the ball of plasma come from? We don't know. Nowhere. It didn't come from anywhere. And there was this ball of plasma that came from nowhere at all, and it just was there. And then a big bang, it started. And everything started to flow at that point, and it grew, and the things cooled. You got suns, you got planets, and then you got people, and you got us, and all of that happened. But it all started at Big Bang, the first delta T click of time, right? When that ball of plasma was let loose to do whatever it did according to the rule set. That's when our reality started. So that ball of plasma has to predate our reality, doesn't it? Because our reality didn't start until you let it all loose and let it expand. Then it expanded into what we call the physical universe. But as a ball of plasma, it was not our physical universe. And why was it just sitting there as a ball of plasma? And what contained it? And how did they get there in the first place? You see, all these questions and there aren't any answers for them. Well, that's the same way. So that's an attribute of a virtual reality, is that it just starts and there's no reason behind the start. It just starts. Well, that's the way our reality works, right? It just starts. And there was lots of those kinds of things. We could go through lots of things that say, is this a virtual reality? And you'd say, well, what are the characteristics of a virtual reality? And you'll find out that we have in this physical universe all the characteristics of a virtual reality. You know, it's obvious. And there's one other point then I guess I should make here, is that to make a virtual reality, to try to build this, to simulate this reality from the ground up, which means from the tiniest particles to the little bigger things, you know, the subatomic particles to atomic particles, which are atoms, to molecules, to stuff that we interact with, to do all that would be a horrendous calculation, something that we couldn't do. And actually you can prove that it's impossible. You can't do that. It's too much. You know, you can't start with particles and then build up everything out of those tiny particles. It's just impossible. So how then do you have a simulation? Well, only physicists think that you have to have a simulation from the bottom up, because that's just the way they think. Big things are made out of little things, you know, and all the little stuff are at the bottom. And anyway, of course, they also know that all the little stuff at the bottom is all non-physical. They're all probability distributions. They're not actually solid little chunks of matter anyway, but and they don't know what that means. You know, they have no idea what that means. They just know that's how it works. So obviously it's not built up that way. Now, if you go from the bottoms up, you can always tell what's going to happen next, right? Because what happens next is just an extrapolation of what's going on in the past. The past determines the future. That's determinism. That's why materialism has to be deterministic. So if you knew all the states of something, you know, at this time, you could calculate everything else that would ever happen, because it's deterministic. It's a big machine. And if you know all the way things interact, then you could just, you know, it all does that way. So you always know what's going to happen next because it's from the bottom up. But the world can't be modeled that way. That's a very foolish way to try to model it. You model it statistically. You have to model it with statistics and probability. Okay, so for instance, if I was making well, maybe it's not such a good example. What I was going to say is that take something real simple, like just the simplest kind of machine I can think of, which is a cannon. It's just a tube, and you pour a little gunpowder in at one end, you roll a ball in on top of that, and then you light a little wick that sets the gunpowder on fire. It builds up a lot of pressure. When the gunpowder burns, it expands, it gets hot, and it pushes the ball out the other end. I mean, it's just a very simple machine. It's only got one moving part, you know, and that's the ball that comes out the other end. Okay, but to model that in a computer, for us to do a computer simulation of that from the bottom up, starting with subatomic particles, we couldn't do it. Just that one thing. It would take all the supercomputers on the planet working together, and then it would still take a week before you could get one ball out of the cannon, if you had to do it in terms of subatomic particles. It just doesn't make any sense. But how do we model it? We model it with probability and statistics. Okay? So we know that if you just shoot a cannon 100 times, all the balls don't all land on top of each other. The balls get spread out all over. It's called ballistic dispersion. And that's because the barrel isn't really perfectly cylindrical. The ball isn't really perfectly, a sphere. The things aren't really that smooth. They get all kinds of, at the small levels, they get all kinds of things. The powder doesn't burn uniformly. It burns differently, every time. So you got a lot of difference. Then as the barrel gets hot, it tends to expand and change. And when the barrel actually flexes a little bit, when a cannonball goes out of a barrel, that pressure wave makes the barrel flex a little as it goes. The hotter, the more rounds you fire, the hotter it gets, the more flexing it does. So there's lots of things going on there. But if you fire a cannon 100 times, you'll get a pattern of the balls out there. There'll be some, and it'll be in a probability distribution. It'll be, most of them fall sort of around here, but there's a few outliers on this side, a few outliers on that side. And you've got this nice little curve with a hump in the middle and, you know, goes out on the tails. And that's the probability distribution of those cannonballs. All right, now let me make a model of a cannon that's not from the ground up, but it's probability. I got that probability distribution. Well, I can just say, give me that probability distribution, and my model of the cannon is just simply fire a cannonball, take a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities, and I just put a ball there. That's where the ball lands. Boom. Where's the next one land? Take another random draw from that probability distribution of the possibility. You know, the possibilities are all the places that the balls could land. One's not going to land back behind the cannon. You know, that's not possible. So there's just a certain amount of possibilities you have that where it could land. And let's say those possibilities are 1 square centimeter of all the land that's out in front of the cannon. You know, each one's a possibility. It could land on any one of those. Well, what's the probability it would land on any one of those centimeters? Well, we can do that. So we just take a random draw from that probability distribution and it lands on one of those centimeters out there in front. Now, some of those centimeters have a higher probability than others. The one out on the edges, pretty low probability it's going to land out there. Maybe 1 out of every 100 might land out there. Most of them will land kind of in front of the cannon more directly, but spread around. So anyhow, that's the model. Now I can have a cannon in my simulation. I can have 10,000 cannons in my simulation, and all my computer has to do is take 10,000 random draws out of a basically a data sheet, you know, that has the probability in it. And now my cannon's modeled. You see, so that's how you model a cannon with probability and statistics. But you have to know the probability distribution to do that. So you have to have fired a cannon a whole bunch of times, taken the data, the probability data, now you can do it. But our model has the rule set. It starts with the rule set. That rule set is mostly deterministic with some randomness in it, because some randomness is natural. So we have that. And with that rule set, I can develop the probability distribution. My rule set for cannonballs says, well, okay, they're gonna go mostly on a this kind of a curve. They're gonna land out in there, and I can do that math pretty easily. I can model that system pretty easily. Physicists can model that very, very simply. You know, it takes a billionth of a second to compute that where that cannonball goes in a simulation. You know, it's very easy. Okay, well, our simulation is done in terms of statistics and probability. It's a probability model. The probability distributions come from the rule set, but it only has to do that once. You see, if I do the calculations to make a distribution, and I don't have to do them all the way down to the tiniest particle, I can do them just to whatever resolution the game needs. Some games need more resolution than other games, you know, it just depends. So I'll do the model just to whatever the resolution of the game requires. And once I've done that once, well, that satisfies now for 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 cannons can be fired. I don't have to do it for every time. I just do it once. I've got the probability distribution. Now every cannon that's going to be fired in this war, I can just grab it's basically a lookup table of where that cannonball lies, which is very, very fast in a computer. It grabs a piece of data and goes. So it has to do a random draw each time, but that's the way it works. So you can see now, modeling things with probability, if you have an understanding of the rule set underneath, is pretty easy. You don't have to model everything into atoms and molecules. You don't need that kind of resolution. That's way more resolution than you need. But you need to do that if you're going to build this materialistic thing, because otherwise you can't tell what's going to happen next if you don't do it down at that level. So we have a situation where the system goes in and takes a random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities, and that's what happens next. So, okay, now how does that work? Let's say you do something, let's say you get a big telescope, bigger than anybody's ever had before. It'll see further than anybody's ever seen before. And you set it up and you turn it on and you look at a piece of outer space that's never been seen before. What are you going to see? Well, we know what we've seen in other parts of the universe where we have looked. We haven't looked that far out before, but we know sort of what's out there. So there's a lot of possibilities. And all of those possibilities have some probability. Some of them are more likely than others. So when your new fancy telescope looks out there where nobody's looked before, a random draw is taken from a probability distribution of the possibilities, and that is what you see. Because there's nothing out there. This is a virtual reality. There isn't anything out there. Nothing's ever been rendered out there. But the system wants to know, what should it render? All right, you're going to look out there. It's got to render something. What is it going to render? Well, it renders random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities. That's how it knows what to render. You dig a hole in your backyard. What's going to be in there? Be in there. Dirt, and okay, that's got a high probability. Rocks, pretty high probability. Roots, dinosaur bone, not such a high probability. Depends on where you're digging, where you live, right? It might, some kind of treasure, not too likely, but there's some probability. So it just takes a random draw. Now, occasionally you get that 1 in 10,000. That random draw can draw something very unlikely, but not often, only once every 10,000, So you do get odd things every once in a while that'll show up. So that's how our reality works. None of it is defined. Only what we see is what's defined. So I'm sitting here, but the computer is not rendering a brain in my head, optic nerves. It's not rendering any oxygen in the air that I'm breathing. It's not even rendering any air. Unless I wave my hand and I'm aware of the feel of the air in a room, then it renders that. But it doesn't render any of my internal organs. I don't have any heart. I don't have any intestines. I don't have any of that stuff going on. Now, if somebody cuts me open and looks for it, it has to render something. So it looks at what are the probabilities. And that's what it gets. But none of that's rendered. So you see, it becomes now a very simple thing to render. You don't have any more detail than's necessary. It's a very efficient process. Very efficient.